Well, good morning and welcome to the Critical Realist Network webinar series. My name is Timothy Rotzo and it is my pleasure to host this event today. So over the past few months we have been exploring what a post-positivist social science might look like and have been trying to get to the heart of how realism or critical realism might allow us to do better empirical work. In the last few webinars we have explored symbolic interactionism and naturalism with Gary Allen Fine, field and system theory with Larissa Buchholz, and today we are joined by Claire Decoteau to discuss realist ethnography. So let me introduce our guest speaker. Claire attained her PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and is currently an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is a theorist and an ethnographer, in that order, whose research focuses on epistemic contestations over issues of health, as well as the politics of knowledge production, people's grounded experiences with healing and healthcare systems, and the effects of neoliberalism on post-colonial societies. She has also written several articles on critical realism and causality, as well as engagements with French theorists from Bourdieu to Lacan. And she is here today to talk about the relationship between realism and ethnography. Now, before I hand it over to Claire, if you are joining us for the first time, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after this webinar. The format of the session today will be a 30 to 40-minute presentation by Claire, followed by a question and answer time. To ask a question, you will need to find the question and answer tab on the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. And if you type your question, I will relay it to Claire. She will give the answer and we'll have a bit of a discussion following that. So Claire, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks Tim for hosting and for all of you for tuning in and listening today. So the talk today is called Realist Ethnography, and I'm just going to jump right in here. In an effort to make ethnography more scientific and therefore more legible as a legitimate method under the still tacitly dominant logic of positivism in the social sciences, many scholars have advocated for the quantification of ethnographic methods and analysis. For ethnographers frustrated with this trend, critical realism may be a useful, though underutilized, tool for engaging in post-positivist research and analysis. It offers ethnographers a philosophical basis for holding ontological realism and epistemological humility in tension, thereby making it possible to forge analyses that move beyond the situation to construct complex structural causal explanations that take historical contingency and concept dependence seriously. Because of its commitment to emergence and the ontological stratification of reality, it also offers ethnographers a means of conceptualizing subjectivity and agency as processual and dynamic, and always situated in a broader structural and cultural context. And yet, because ethnography has not yet been utilized extensively by critical realists, there are some aspects of ethnographic study that push critical realism into new theoretical domains. Ethnography, therefore, has something also to offer critical realism. In this talk, I begin by offering some points of comparison between grounded theory, extended case method, and critical realism. I then suggest that there are some important tools that critical realism offers ethnographers in particular. Throughout the talk, however, I also highlight the ways in which ethnography also offers key interventions into critical realist thinking and pushes critical realism to augment certain features of its philosophical bases. Grounded theory, or GT, was established by Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss to counter a prevailing trend in sociology in the 1960s on verifying as opposed to generating theory through empirical analysis. The approach emerged out of the Chicago school tradition and subscribes to analytic induction. It is out of the context of discovery that theory emerges. According to them, quote, generating theory from data means that most hypotheses and concepts not only come from the data, but are systematically worked out in relation to the data during the course of research. GT researchers are interested in patterns of action, as well as changes in these action patterns over time. Through the use of methodological techniques like constant comparative analysis, theoretical sampling, open coding, and memo taking, GT strives to generate theory that both fits the data and works when used to explain behaviors. Groups sampled on theoretical grounds are compared in order to generate emergent theoretical categories. Analysts develop ideas at a higher level of conceptual abstraction than the qualitative material being analyzed, so that substantive theory is generated from analysis of raw data, and formal theory is generated from findings drawn from many studies pertaining to an abstract sociological category. GT approaches also promote predictability, in the sense that, quote, if elsewhere approximately similar conditions obtain, then approximately similar consequences should occur, end quote. Grounded theory has been critiqued for bracketing the involvement of the researcher as biased and suspending context in order to make cases comparable. Michael Burawoy has been a vocal critic of the approach. He argues that the world is ordered by theory, and failing to account for this is an epistemological fairy tale. The main architects of these approaches, of the grounded theory approaches, however, have amended their initial emphasis on rigid induction and highlighted the importance of theoretical sensitization to disciplinary knowledge as well as the researcher's past experiences. In addition, the second generation of grounded theorists, most notably Kathy Shermaz and Adele Clark, are invested in illustrating how attention to reflexivity and the acknowledgement of multiple standpoints has pushed grounded theory away from positivism. However, grounded theory remains best at analyzing the immediate situations within which actors make decisions and forge pathways of action. One of the primary difficulties with grounded theory approaches to ethnography is that there is no mechanism for adjudicating between different theoretical frames. How do we know which theoretical category to employ and which is more accurate for describing the situation at hand? Critical realist Roy Boschkar labeled this particular problem judgmental relativism, wherein there are no rational criteria for adjudicating between theoretical explanations. Part of the problem is that while grounded theory can reveal people's action pathways and resources for choice-making, we are not provided with the structural conditions within which these choices are made available or actions pursued. Grounded theory analysis misses the structural constraints and discursive resources that shape people's trajectories of action. Extended case method. On the opposite side of the methodological continuum, the extended case method, or ECM, considers the structural forces that impinge upon local processes. The Manchester School of Social Anthropology first coined the phrase extended case method, wherein theoretical framing was used to justify sampling in small n research. Michael Burawoy extended the original focus of ECM by linking it explicitly to structural analysis. ECM is deductive, so cases are predetermined by theory. Burawoy explains, quote, we begin with our favorite theory, but seek not confirmations but refutations that inspire us to deepen that theory, end quote. Anomalous cases are therefore selected. From an initial intervention in a local community, situational knowledges are unpacked so that they can be aggregated into analyses of social processes. One then moves from processes to delineate social forces that impress themselves on the ethnographic locale, which entails a structuration analysis where the everyday world is regarded as simultaneously shaped by and shaping an external field of forces. Often, in Burawoy's own work, comparison becomes an essential tool for analyzing the ways in which external forces might impinge upon local conditions differentially. Comparison, then, is an important tool for ECM ethnographers. For Burawoy, whose approach is inspired by Decoteau's, great breakthroughs arise when scientists turn, quote, an apparent falsification into a brilliant corroboration of the original theory, end quote. Anomalies to the hard core of existing research programs are sought out in order to refine extant theory. Burawoy explains, in a progressive program, the new belts of theory expand the empirical content of the program, not only by absorbing anomalies, but by making predictions, some of which are corroborated, end quote. For Burawoy, causality should be understood processually as opposed to conjuncturally. In ECM, the structural forces yielded causal primacy are determined in advance by the chosen theory, which for him are often economic processes. Anomalies lead to theory refinement, but do not necessarily challenge the prioritization of certain causal mechanisms, which for him are economic. ECM is the method that most closely resembles a critical realist approach. Its adoption of structuration theory means that ECM researchers heed the mutual constitution of subjects and structures. In fact, Burawoy's own case studies show his careful attention to the relationship between habitus and field. However, there are several important differences between critical realism and ECM. Burawoy rejects what he refers to as methodological dualism, the notion that there is an external world that can be construed as separate from and incommensurable with those who study it. As such, he would likely take issue with critical realism's insistence that structural mechanisms are distinct from the events they trigger, and that the world and its mechanisms are far too complicated to ever fully know or explain. I return to this point in a moment. Also, in ECM, theory determines not only case selection, but also the weighting of causal mechanisms, which severely delimits the direction and scope of explanation. In critical realism, however, the best causal models have strong evidentiary basis, the greatest explanatory power, and the widest theoretical scope. In other words, critical realists do not delimit in advance the scope of their theoretical domain, but rather seek out theories with the broadest possible explanatory power. Even though Bourgeois claims that causality for ECM researchers is processual and can be multiple, it is also law-like, positing a probable conjunction between two events, which makes prediction possible. In critical realism, however, causality is always contingent and conjunctural. Structural forces tend to engender certain courses of action given their internal powers, but their effects are always contingent, making prediction impossible. I now move on to explaining what critical realism has to offer ethnographers. I will not provide an exhaustive overview of critical realism, as I presume that this audience is familiar with it. But I will provide summaries of the tenets I think are most relevant to ethnographers and highlight how they might be useful in ethnographic research and analysis. Because the social is an open and not a closed system, experimentation in the social sciences can be difficult. Positivism's insistence on the constant conjunction of events presumes a controlled experimental environment. Conversely, critical realism assumes that underlying causal mechanisms, which may operate even when unobservable, are ontologically distinct from the events to which they give rise. Otherwise, it would be impossible to take results determined in the lab and apply them to the world. In other words, scientists presume that the causal mechanisms under analysis in artificially controlled lab experiments also operate outside the laboratory. The scientist is only responsible for triggering a mechanism already in existence and controlling for interference from other mechanisms, but does not create the mechanism being tested. Critical realists then argue that mechanisms are independent from the events they generate. Roy Bhaskar explains this as such. The world consists of mechanisms, not events. Such mechanisms combine to generate the flux of phenomena that constitute the actual states and happenings of the world. They may be said to be real, though it is rare that they are actually manifest, and rarer still that they are empirically identified by men. They are the intransitive objects of scientific theory. They are not unknowable. They can become manifest to men in experience. This is the arduous task of science. Ontological structures which are socially produced come to exist in three domains. The empirical, which is how we experience the world, the actual, which are the events themselves, of which we only experience a fraction, and the real, which is a deep dimension where one finds the generative mechanisms producing the events in the world. This stratification of reality allows Bhaskar to complicate his theory of causality because certain structures have unexercised powers, as well as powers that are exercised but unrealized, and powers that are realized but unperceived. Ontological stratification between levels of the actual, the level of events, and the real, the level of the causal mechanism, are combined with a kind of horizontal stratification where causal structures are always understood to be multiple and diverse, combining in wholly contingent and unpredictable ways. Bhaskar explains, quote, "Now it is characteristic of open systems that two or more mechanisms, perhaps of radically different kinds, combine to produce effects. So that because we do not know ex ante which mechanisms will actually be at work, and perhaps have no knowledge of their mode of articulation, events are not deductively predictable. Most events in open systems must thus be regarded as conjunctures. This means that no one event is caused by any one isolated causal mechanism. Rather, events are always overdetermined by constellations of causal mechanisms. Causal constellations are non-repeatable and unpredictable. Further, any comparable event may not be caused by the same constellation of causal factors, no matter the event's similarities. To make matters more complicated, as I already explained, mechanisms may be exercised without being realized, or they may be realized but unperceivable. Explanation then demands that we contend with all of this causal complexity. Even as critical realists recognize the open and dynamic nature of the social world, certain mechanisms may, over restricted regions of time-space, be reproduced continuously and come to form demi or partial regularities. Tony Lawson gives the example of women being concentrated in secondary sectors of the labor market. These demi-regularities are not universal, but they do show the actualization of a mechanism in a semi-consistent fashion over a very specific time-space. Lawson suggests that it is because of these dim irregularities that contrastive cases become an important means of analysis in the social sciences. Instead of artificially controlling for all variables but one in an experimental design, critical realist social scientists attempt to find comparable populations or events with similar histories where we would expect to find similar outcomes. When we find instead a puzzling difference in outcome, we hypothesize a heretofore unknown causal mechanism, and then we empirically test for this missing mechanism. Lawson explains, quote, "In short, any patterning, any standing out of phenomena which turns upon differences or unanticipated or surprising or implausible relationships of some kind, whether primarily social, historical, or geographical, can serve to alert us to the existence or way of acting of some item previously unknown, unrecognized, or perhaps known only implicitly in some taken for granted way." In fact, Lawson suggests that scientific explanation is inherently contrastive. George Steinmetz complicates Lawson's general contrastive method, which relies on isolating singular causal mechanisms in a comparative research project. Steinmetz urges us to compare across either generative causal mechanism or across empirical level events. He suggests that case comparisons of the small n type can be most explicative in unpacking the complexity of both events and their conjunctural causal features. Steinmetz explains, quote, "The elements that constitute causal constellations may vary from case to case. And even if we do find recurrent empirical patterns, these can never be assumed to be universal or to be determined by the same set of mechanisms in each case. Comparison thus can focus on the differing empirical effects of a single mechanism or on the differing conjunctures leading to similar outcomes," end quote. Dave Eldervoss suggests that explanation in the social sciences requires the concept of emergence, where the entity or structure created comes to have powers distinct from its component parts. Within the natural sciences, water is the prototypical example of emergence because it comes to have its own ontological existence as a substance distinct from hydrogen and oxygen. Eldervoss explains, quote, "The powers and properties of an object or entity can be ascribed to the organization of its parts into a particular kind of complex whole," end quote. Eldervoss suggests that some explanations may require a laminated view of the entity being explained, where the whole is stratified into an ensemble of parts at various ontological levels, each of which may exert causal force. For example, in explaining a particular effect of capitalism, one might need to view capitalism as its own global force acting on a population or event, or one may extract a composite part of capitalism, like the property relation, to explain a particular event. For Eldervoss, quote, "Causation is never truly independent of what is happening at other levels in the individual instance. It is only analytically independent when generalized. Cause, as we generally understand and apply it, is therefore an attempt to simplify and extract from the impossible complexity of actual causation," end quote. One further complication I would like to add to this critical realist account comes from William Sewell, who is not an avowed critical realist, but who holds similar views on causality, namely that structures and events can be studied as separate phases of analysis, that events are contingent and therefore unpredictable, and that causality is always conjunctural. But Sewell augments critical realism by suggesting that structures exist at different depths, vary widely in the kinds of powers they can mobilize, and may be long and enduring, or consist of sudden ruptures. Therefore, Sewell adds an analysis of structural depth, strength, and endurance to the critical realist toolkit. Further, Sewell always insists on the duality of structures, or the ways that they only exist in and through the people who make them up and have the power to change them. This is a point that is recognized by critical realists, especially in the work by Margaret Archer on morphogenesis, but it is oftentimes sidelined in critical realist accounts. Archer explains that society has no predetermined shape or set of powers, and that structures take shape and are formed by agents, even if we separate these two different modes of action, structural and agential, in our analysis. Ethnography can highlight this point about the mutual causality of agents and structures. This is what ethnographic analysis offers critical realism, an explication of the reverse nature of causality, that agents positioned differentially act back upon structural mechanisms in sometimes unexpected ways, further complicating a critical realist account of causality. Critical realists highlight two crucial aspects of causality: that causal mechanisms can be compared independently of the events they inspire and must be understood as contingent and conjunctural. But they often fail to highlight the mutual constitution of agents and structures. Ethnographic methods can overcome this limitation. Agents can strategically utilize the conjuncture of structures to not only navigate their social world, but intervene in it, thereby shifting the content and force of those structures moving forward. Let me provide the briefest of empirical examples here to illustrate this point. For the past 4 years, I have been engaged in ethnographic research with Somali refugees in Minneapolis and Toronto, whose children have very high rates of autism. Somalis make sense of their vulnerability to autism by centering their experiences as migrants and racial others. They argue that it is the health and food industries of North America that are responsible for a series of environmental insults that their children are vulnerable to because their bodies are ill-prepared for such toxicity. In both locations, Somalis have forged epistemic communities united around a common ideology and course of treatment. While certain features of these epistemic communities hold constant across the 2 locations of Minneapolis and Toronto, which is a comparison at the level of the event, many of the structural features informing group formation vary between the 2 sites. This is a comparison at the level of the mechanism. These structural differences include racial formations, refugee policies, autism health policies, and the broader difference between private and public health provision, responses to vaccine hesitancy, and the involvement of local public health, education, and medical communities. These different structural contexts have influenced the content, composition, and coherence of the Somali autism communities over time in the 2 locations. To take one particularly salient example of this, the racial formations of the 2 countries, meaning the United States and Canada, differ in a wide variety of ways, and the Somali community in Minnesota has been very successful in using the discourse of racial disparity to garner resources and attention to their plight. This has been less successful in Toronto. But in Minneapolis, this is not simply a matter of a structural causal mechanism, i.e. racial formation, operating differently in Toronto and Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Somali community activated this structural mechanism, and through the strategic manipulation of U.S. racial politics, managed to transform existing structural dynamics in Minneapolis. Recognizing the conjunctural nature of causality helps the researcher analyze how agents come to exercise agency and creativity in navigating the system that informs and shapes their actions. Somalis in Minneapolis were able to use the vulnerabilities of the U.S. racial system to advocate for better health resources for their children. In addition to highlighting subjects' agency, understanding the conjunctural nature of causality can help the researcher unpack the combination of structures that inform the eventful outcome of Somalis in Minneapolis being able to impact local autism advocacy and systems of care. In other words, race did not operate in isolation as the key variable in question. Rather, its salience arose in part from its relationship to other structures, including the medical, education, and public healthcare systems. Another aspect of critical realism that is highlighted and can be augmented by ethnographic analysis is that of concept dependence. According to Bhaskar, concept dependence is one of the main ways in which social and natural mechanisms differ. Social structures, unlike natural structures, do not exist independently of the activities they govern, do not exist independently of the agent's conceptions of what they are doing in their activity, and may be only relatively enduring. By activity dependence, Bhaskar asserts that mechanisms at work in society exist only in virtue of their effects, meaning social structures only exist insofar as they shape the activities of people and are thereby reproduced. Social mechanisms also exhibit greater time-space specificity. Space-time dependence points to the fact that social mechanisms are only relatively enduring rather than eternal or unchanging. Finally, social structures are co-determined by social knowledge. Anthony King suggests that there is a core antinomy in Bhaskara's realism because, quote, society is dependent on individuals and yet also independent of them, end quote. Similarly, Isaac Reed argues that in conceptualizing the ontological as layered, where real mechanisms have causal power independent of when they are exercised, and actual mechanisms can be realized without being perceived, Bhaskar undermines his claim that mechanisms are at least partially concept-dependent. In response to this second critique, it's important to take a moment to explain intransitivity. The transitive dimension of knowledge refers to references, and the intransitive dimension refers to reference. However, as Al-Moody and Wilmot explain, quote, knowledge does not exist in a separate world. The transitive is differentiated from, but not exterior to, the intransitive. For Bhaskar, explanations about the intransitive dimensions of the world are always historically and culturally mediated and are therefore relative to the time, place, and position of the knower. When critical realists discuss concept dependency, the emphasis is usually placed on the partially independent nature of social forces. But this theoretical stipulation also refers to the dependency of social constructs on interpretation. To alter Marx's famous thesis slightly, the point is that our interpretations of the world can change it. Structures do have a tendency to endure, but their form and content shifts over time, often in response to not only the actions of participants, but also their interpretations of both their own actions and the structures within which they act. And when the content and form of structures shifts, so too do mechanisms and their causal effects. Let me return briefly to the case of autism within the Somali community. In Toronto, Somali parents of children with autism believe that shifts in their diet, the overuse of antibiotics in food production and healthcare, and the toxicity of their environment has dramatically shifted their gut microbiome, making their children's guts vulnerable to attack by pathogenic bacteria, which negatively impacts their synaptic brain development. This is a distinct ontology of the body that suggests that we have colonies of bacteria living within us that control our behavior, some of which negatively affect our healthiness. Somalis have subscribed to this episteme, this way of understanding the world around them, in order to make sense of their structural conditions as migrants and racialized others, and their subjective experiences, that changing their children's diets improved their behaviors. Their investment in this particular way of understanding autism has also influenced the structures of autism itself, because they have pushed back against mainstream science through their participation in social movements and through their involvement in research linking the microbiome and autism. This is an illustration of how concept dependency operates. Social structures are ontologically real, even if they are socially constructed and gain objectivity and exteriority through processes of institutionalization and historicization. But they are also transformable through radical action, or slowly over the longue durée. Actors sometimes experience structures as exteriorities that are constraining, but actors are also consistently constituting said structures. The relationship between the two is one of mutuality, not unidirectional constraint. Although Archer's morphogenesis highlights the mutual causality of structures and agents, and concept dependence implies that people's interpretations of their world can have an impact on structural mechanisms, these are not points that are often highlighted in critical realist accounts or put into action through empirical application. I think this might be in part because ethnography has not been utilized extensively by many critical realists. This is something that ethnography can bring to critical realism, an application and augmentation of these particular theoretical tenets. This would also ensure that the intransitivity of the ontological real is not mistaken for structural determinism, essentialism, or naturalism. Because the relationship between a causal power and its effects are external and contingent, explanation requires that generative mechanisms be studied in their context. Therefore, decontextualizing relationships through the analysis of variables, as positivists do, makes little sense to a critical realist. In addition, because social structures are only exist partially autonomously from the actions they condition or the actors' concepts of what they are doing, and they are only relatively enduring, we have to abandon all efforts to suggest causality operates in constant conjunctions. Critical realism can then be marshaled towards tracing the causal powers of structural relations, which is not a common feature of ethnographic explanation. But it is also used to map the ways in which those structures are constantly being changed by actors, either in reproductive morphostatic ways or in transformative morphogenetic ways. As such, social structures are not just emergent, but they are constantly emerging. Because reality exists independently of our apprehension of it, our theories are always fallible. They require constant empirical testing and adjustment, and they will never be capable of ultimately capturing the structured messes of our social reality. Now that I have explained how conjunctural causality and its complicated features can be used by ethnographers to unpack the ways in which structures are received by and reacted upon by agents, I want to turn to unpacking the ways in which critical realism, or an augmented version of it that puts it into conversation with Bourdieu's theories of habitus, might also offer us a more complicated theory of subjectivity and action. Most ethnographic approaches, with the notable exception of extended case method, emerge out of the Chicago school tradition and focus on the ways in which people's action pathways can be understood with reference to their immediate situation. Critical realism is similar to ECM in that it focuses on how people's actions and the situations within which they act can best be understood by contextualizing the broader structural dynamics and cultural logic that inform those actions. And yet, given this more macro approach to ethnography, one might imagine that critical realism has nothing to offer a micro perspective on subjectivity, decision-making, and reflexivity. I suggest in this next section that an approach that takes ontological stratification seriously can offer a very nuanced approach to understanding subjectivity and action. Gary Potter argues that if we marry critical realism's ontological stratification and Louis Wacquant's work on the primary and secondary habitus, we can arrive at an understanding of habitus as historically layered. On the level of the real, Bourdieu discusses the deep structures of the habitus, which are forged through originary experiences and which are difficult to challenge. But then he also insists that each habitus is different because it is always contingent on experiences and the relations within which those experiences are embedded, which either modifies or reinforces its structure. Therefore, any given event or situation within which the habitus is embedded may result in different actions because there are multiple mechanisms at various levels of depth in play. In addition, contradictions may arise within and between these levels of structural conditioning. In my own work, I argue that in order to understand how a multiply layered habitus may lead to greater reflexivity and even social change, we need to situate the habitus within an analysis of field effects. I suggest that people's identities are constituted precisely through their participation in more than one field, which may be in a state of doxic homology or in an unsettled state of heterodoxy. Even if there is a strong illusio in a particular doxic field, each individual person is always situated at the intersection of multiple overlapping fields, with disparate valuations and distributions of capital, which can provide each of us with multiple and quite often contradictory ontological orientations and perspectives. Our interstitial positionality offers us unique positions from which to reflexively evaluate and navigate our structural and cultural conditioning through embodied practices. Often, fields are assumed to be relatively stable and homologous, and it is the movement of new people into those fields or structures that create dissonance. Even though Bourdieu also often assumed doxic fields, which were relatively stable over time, he does provide some tools for thinking about unsettled fields, or fields ensconced in struggle. He explains, quote, "The dominated in any social universe can always exert a certain force, inasmuch as belonging to a field means by definition that one is capable of producing effects in it." And in fact, he suggests that reflexivity always emerges not only from field position, but from the layout and structure of the field at the time. Fields may be more or less settled, and this has an effect on the subjects within the field. Fields are also layered. Practices which are, according to Bourdieu, quote, "hailed as resistant," they only have a superficial impact on the effective relations of the field without challenging its deeper structural relations. Therefore, in addition to understanding the multi-layered nature of the habitus, we have to add an analysis of field dynamics, which are not only multiple, but equally layered across time and space. For reflexivity to occur, disjunctures might arise horizontally across field positions or vertically across layers of a temporal sedimentation within the habitus. And depending on the status of the field and whether or not the subjects within it are able, as a collective, to grasp and explain the crisis, to seize upon it and articulate it as heterodoxy, these disjunctures may be more or less morphogenetic. Critical realism's insistence on contingent conjunctural causality complements such a reading of field and habitus. Contingency here means that complex events are co-determined by constellations of causal mechanisms. Therefore, in any given social situation, subjects' actions are not only informed by their own layered internal structures, but they also gain reflexivity because of the perspective yielded them by their interstitial field position. Any individual or collective action can be analyzed by exploring the conjuncture of both field-specific mechanisms and disjunctures within the habitus, which also reflect previous field experiences and conflicts. Let me provide two quick examples. In Bourdieu's self-analysis, he describes his experiences of feeling like both an outsider and an insider at the lycée, which made him disenchanted. He suggests that he was, quote, "caught between two worlds and their irreconcilable values," end quote. On the one hand, he was a boarder, so to occupy this position like the other boys from surrounding agricultural areas, he was supposed to scorn education and act out in highly masculinized ways through pranks and sports. The day boys were from a higher economic echelon, and they performed well in school, but the boarders viewed them as more feminine. Bourdieu himself was caught between these worlds, enamored with his studies, but nonetheless skeptical of the institution and wanting to participate in the peasant boys' pranks. It is here where the disjuncture he feels his whole life between his original habitus and his acquired one begins. He explains, quote, "This dual experience could only compound the durable effect of a very strong discrepancy between high economic consecration and low social origin. In other words, a cleft habitus inhabited by tensions and contradictions. This kind of coincidence of contraries no doubt helped to institute in a lasting way an ambivalent, contradictory relationship to the academic institution." End quote. Bourdieu himself was caught between two worlds, between two different field dynamics, and occupied a contradictory relationship to them both. He was no longer simply a boarder, but he was not yet, or quite ever, a day boy. This contradiction leaves a cleavage in his habitus, which I am suggesting is much more common than Bourdieu generally allows. To return to the case of Somalis and autism, the epistemic communities in both Toronto and Minneapolis have often joined forces with other parents who are part of a rather large alternative autism movement, which pushes back against mainstream understandings of autism causation and treatment. And yet, because of their unique positionality as racial and national others, they also bring a kind of reflexivity to their involvement in these organizations that their white contemporaries do not share. Their field positionality and identities allow them to retain a kind of critical distance from both the medical mainstream and the alternative movement, which provides them with a unique vantage point for constructing new knowledge on autism based on their unique outsider status. In conclusion, then, I have tried to highlight some primary ways in which core tenets of critical realism might provide a helpful philosophical backdrop for ethnographers seeking to complicate their post-positivist analyses. I began by highlighting how grounded theory and extended case method approaches differ from one inspired by critical realism. I then moved on to show how critical realism might offer ethnographers helpful tools with regard to causal inference and comparison. Critical realism reveals that there are multiple levels at which phenomena can be compared, at the level of the event itself and at the level of the real, where causal mechanisms operate. These mechanisms never act alone, but are always in concert with other mechanisms, making any event overdetermined by a constellation of forces that are difficult to isolate in the open system of the social. Critical realism and the work of William Sewell offer us methodological tools for parsing out the complexity of causal mechanisms that generate contingent conjunctions. And yet, critical realism can also benefit from further engagement with ethnography, particularly by recognizing the mutual causal relationship between the actual and the real. As agents navigate, use, and strategically deploy the schemas and resources made available to them by their structural positionalities, they actively transform those same structures. Agents do not passively accept the unchanging powers and forces of a static system that informs them, but rather have the power to transform existing structures precisely because of the contingent and conjunctural nature of causality and the concept-dependent nature of structural effects. I then moved on to focus on how critical realist engagement with Bourdieu might offer ethnographers a very complicated but useful means of unpacking the layered nature of motivation and reflexivity. The reformulation of Bourdieusian habitus in relation to field positionality and temporal sedimentation retains the embodied nature of the habitus and understands the interpenetration of the social and the personal. In my formulation, a personal emergent property is unique to an individual because of her unique field position and trajectory. These relational experiences then cohere inside the internal structure of the habitus. In this way, the habitus is not only emergent, but is constantly emerging in relation to field dynamics. In the end, one garners multiple perspectives and strategies because one is never the product of simply one stagnant field, but is always situated at the intersection of multiple conjuncturally related social and cultural fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That was really interesting. So just a reminder, you can send in questions. There is a questions tab on the control panel of the GoToWebinar, and if you submit those, I'll be able to pass them on to Claire. And as a few more questions come in, Claire, I wanted to go back to the beginning, and you raised a very briefly the question of judgmental rationalism, and that one of the problems with grounded theory as well as other theories is that it tends to operate with a judgmental relativism, where there are no resources, rational or otherwise, for deciding between different theoretical explanations. And you appealed to the notions of explanatory power, and I think it was theoretical scope. I've been really interested in this whole question of judgmental rationalism and the resources for deciding, evaluating, different theoretical positions. And I was hoping you might be able to say a little bit more about that and how you see explanatory power and theoretical scope as cashing out when it comes to explanation in ethnography.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a difficult one. I mean, I think that obviously, grounded theorists also have, as I mentioned, sort of challenged some of the initial dynamics of their own approaches early on, and especially in the work of Adele Clark, have also pointed to the ways in which multiple standpoints are also informing, multiple standpoints of the researcher, but also of the participants, are also informing the sort of theoretical tools that the ethnographer brings to the case. So I think that I tried to nuance that a little bit by suggesting that there has been sort of a reflection and a critique on that very issue and problem within grounded theory as subsequent researchers have worked on that issue. And I don't think that it's an easy one for ethnographers by any means, because one can critique sort of a Michael Buravoyan approach of kind of bringing the theory that you're already invested in, a Marxist, for him, a particular Marxist approach to understanding capitalism, to the field with you, versus trying to kind of explore the various theories that are out there that might help you to make the most explanatory sense of the ethnographic locale that you're in. These are not easy questions, I think, for ethnographers or any researcher for that matter to navigate. I think that the best thing is, of course, to be kind of open epistemologically to different theoretical traditions, to not sort of decide from the outset which theoretical tradition one is situated in, to be open to different epistemological orientations kind of consistently. But I think another key aspect of this for ethnographers that many ethnographers have written on over the years is a consistent shuttling back and forth between the empirical site and the theoretical frameworks that we're using. I think without a constant shuffling and kind of abandoning the sense that we learn everything that we're going to learn and then we go to the field as if that's some sort of separate space, headspace or literal physical space, is a myth, of course, and that we really need to be constantly shifting and changing and thinking about our fields, sites in different ways through different theoretical lenses in order to kind of shift our own understanding of what we're seeing, to kind of get inside the ontologies of the people that we're studying, to listen to their own theoretical perspectives on what they're on their own understandings of what they're doing. And I think this takes a certain openness on the part, an epistemological openness on the part of the researcher to listen to all of those different resources of theoretical engagement, but in the end, to choose the ones that do have the most explanatory power. And again, of course, it's not easy to suggest that you have ultimately found the correct theory that absolutely makes sense of this particular case, because that's never true. And I actually think that critical realism is helpful with that kind of epistemological humility, because it suggests that we never will fully understand our cases, that we always need to understand that what's happening is much more complicated than analysts often can even begin to kind of unpack, and so that we have to bring that humility with us as well. I guess that's the best answer I have to that question.
That's a good answer. Thanks, Claire. It's a really difficult question. I think it's perhaps the million-dollar question when it comes to particularly thinking through what realism does for our social research. Now, just to build off of that, and just to build off of the entire concept of judgment, how do you see, say, critical realism as helping when it comes to case selection, particularly compared to something like ECM?
That's another good question. I think that, I think that I have found, I guess in one sense there's some real similarities there between extended case method and critical realism, especially the critical realism that Tony Lawson explains in his work on demi-regularities, and George Steinmetz's work on comparison as well. In part because both ECM and critical realism I don't think that they insist upon contrast and comparison as an approach, but as a helpful approach for isolating mechanisms. So I think that in some sense there is some similarities there between Buravoy in particular's work on ECM and how to select cases, based on being able to identify to some degree similar histories or similar events in order to then see if the structural mechanisms are differing between those events in order to kind of isolate the complexity of causality. I think that I think that I really appreciate George Steinmetz's input on this, because the idea that one could compare both across events and across generative causal mechanisms is to me extremely appealing, as I think that it means that it expands the way that we think about comparison and the way that we might choose cases somewhat differently, as opposed to just choosing them based on their effects. We're choosing them also based on possibly sharing causal mechanisms and having different effects. And I think that that really points to, again, this openness of the social, the fact that even though events might be somewhat similar, we can't ever approach them in quite the way that Theda Skocpol does, for example, in her work on revolutions, because it's just far too complicated to suggest that these effects are so similar that we can compare across such vast swaths of historical, of time-space specificity, basically. So in that sense, I guess that's a tough question. I actually think that extended case method and critical realism might be somewhat similar on this point. But I do find that the kind of comparison between, I guess one difference is then this comparison between generative mechanisms and comparison of events themselves, that adds a little complexity perhaps to what's already being done very effectively in extended case method.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's another really good answer. And sorry, I keep asking you difficult questions. I think they are again, they're some of the harder questions to sort of work through. I was just wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about your Somali study and how these sorts of elements featured into that in terms of the design of the study, how you went about the analysis in terms of some of the nuts and bolts as a way of sort of cashing out some of this.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to talk about that. So, I think that, like most sociologists, I chose these two communities in part because they were. So I first found out about this particular interesting empirical case because there was a series of newspaper articles written about a certain Centers for Disease Control study that had been done in Minnesota that suggested that Somalis did have very high rates of autism compared to other ethnic groups in the area, and that this was the first sort of identification of a non-white middle-class group that was a cluster of cases of autism. And so this kind of drew my attention to what I found was a very interesting empirical case. And but I didn't want to just study the case in Minneapolis. I wanted to be able to compare across different structural dynamics, basically, that might be informing what was happening. So Toronto, the Somali group in Toronto has been less successful than the group in Minneapolis in garnering as much attention and resources to the plight of their children. However, and so there actually is no statistical data available about whether or not, in some sort of positivist way, Somalis have high rates of autism in Toronto. It's just an unanswerable question. However, on the ground, Somalis are very insistent that they do have very high rates of autism, and the services that they're accessing also imply that. So the Toronto case was interesting because it also had a very active group of Somali parents who were extremely active in advocating for their children, but they had been less successful at garnering attention. And so it was an interesting comparison because of both the similarities and differences that the case provided. Also, both locations had the highest settlement of Somali immigrants in Canada and the United States, so that was another kind of regularity that one could kind of hold constant across the two locations. And of course, the Somali communities are in conversation with one another as well across those two places, which is obviously an important part of the mobilization happening. So basically, I was interested in the fact that there were certain things that were held constant across these places. We had Somalis who were experiencing high rates of autism amongst their children, they were pushing back against mainstream explanations of autism in a variety of ways. They were mobilizing for higher visibility of themselves as racialized others who were experiencing autism against a very kind of, in general, the history of autism has a lot of parental advocacy and self-advocacy within it, but a lot of the people who mobilized on the part of autism are white and middle class. And so Somalis have consistently pushed back against that kind of implicit racial bias, I suppose, and the way in which autism is represented by kind of highlighting themselves. And so those are some of the consistent features across the two places. But there are very different features of the structural dynamics that have occurred in the two locations, which I also find fascinating. Because they shape the content of the epistemic communities and what they believe in some sense, but they've also shaped the ways in which Somalis have been able to mobilize, how they understand themselves. So in Minnesota, even though they've been more successful in garnering resources for themselves, they've also come up against, because part of their explanation is that vaccines are a causal factor for the development of autism, the community's actually been very split. So by kind of joining forces with mainstream medicine and mainstream advocacy and research, some Somalis have had to abandon that particular aspect of their explanation, and that's actually split the community. So there are those who are willing to kind of say, okay, vaccines aren't a cause, and they are getting resources and recognition, and those who have not been willing to say that have not. And so that's another interesting feature of Minnesota that I think reveals really fascinating things about vaccine hesitancy in the United States. So, sorry, I've kind of rambled on for a while.
No, that's really helpful.
Those were some of the kind of both similarities across, but also differences between that I think are really fascinating.
So, just again to build off of that, one of the things you mentioned about the influence of the Chicago School is the way in which ethnography, in particular, has been understood in terms of people's actions being informed and responding to particular situations. Whereas you really come at it from a sort of different perspective in terms of structure, in terms of the epistemes, the ontologies that these people operate with, live within. I was just wondering whether you could speak a little to how, on the ground in the field, and then later, how you go about theorizing this, how you go about reconstructing, how you move essentially from the sort of ethnography, the ethnographic aspects, to the reconstruction of the cultural logic, the epistemes, the ontology.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that some of that does come from kind of being willing to, and I think this comes from a very feminist approach to doing ethnography as well, a feminist and post-colonial approach to doing ethnography, which is to suspend my own kind of sense of what might be causing autism in order to really take seriously what people are saying, what their own theories of autism are. And I've done that in my previous work on HIV and AIDS as well, where, and that really is grounded in a very post-colonial and feminist kind of approach to really trying to get inside of people's own epistemes to really understand their own ontological perspectives without judgment on my part. So, and obviously I have my own episteme and ontology that I bring to that conversation, so it's not simply getting inside theirs and not having my own or something really essentialistic like that, but rather, really trying to understand how people understand the world, basically. And that's not an easy thing to do, obviously, especially when one is so very different from the people that one is studying. So that I think is the first thing, is to really have that kind of humility as well, humility that of people's understandings and not taking, because especially with autism, but also obviously with my previous work on HIV, these are very political things, and so everybody always, whenever I present my work on autism, says, yes, 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 but what do you really think? And I think the point is that it doesn't matter what I think. It's not about me. It's about the Somalis and what they think and why they think what they think. And so I think that's the other part of your question. So first is trying to really have the humility to go and really grasp what it is that people believe and take them very seriously. And that part is very ethnographic. I think that takes ethnographic skills that are more the sort of traditional ethnographic skills, which is, you know, doing deep interviews consistently over time, extended interviews, open interviews, but also just hanging out with people and understanding how they understand the world, how they relate to their children, what they're doing, even because sometimes what they do and what they say is different. So what are they doing with their lives? And that's the part that I think is the kind of classic ethnographic approach. But one, of course, as I've been saying, that's informed by a kind of post-colonial and feminist approach to doing this kind of work. And then I think from there, one kind of builds up and out. So then I was interested in, because there are certain things about the beliefs that the Somalis have in Toronto and Minneapolis that are consistent, in part, I think, because they share some kind of Somali cultural or conception of their bodies. They share some of their knowledge resources. They share this very deep commitment to understanding that autism is something that doesn't exist in Somalia. That's something that's shared across the communities. That they really believe that autism is something that has been caused by living in the Western context. Those are things that they share across the two communities that I think comes from their experiences as being migrants and racialized others. And having a sort of shared, to some degree, a shared concept of the body that comes from a kind of Somali conceptualization or cultural logic. But then, although that's shifted, of course, over time. And then it's kind of taking a step back and looking at the broader systems that are also informing upon those and how those kind of ontologies have shifted and changed over time, and how they are articulated within particular contingent experiences that they're having, so and constantly changing. So how are those beliefs and ontologies constantly shifting and moving and emerging in relation to the experiences and conjunctural dynamics that they're situated within? And that, I think, that's the hard. I mean, it's not harder than doing the ethnographic part. They're both hard. But that, I think, then comes, for me, it came with doing interviews with people that the Somalis were working with, so service providers, government officials, policy specialists, social workers, educators, understanding the broader landscape within which they exist and act. And they were helpful for that. I mean, they would suggest, go talk to these people, go talk to these people. These were the people who kicked us out of that program, or these are the programs that are available to people, go talk to them. So then you have to kind of build the landscape around which these ethnographic kind of locales are situated. And that takes just a different kind of, it takes archival work, it takes interviews with kind of more people situated in more macro relationships or more macro positions, I suppose. Yeah, and that's the sort of moving out. But I also don't, I mean, again, I don't kind of do the ethnographic part and then move out. I do that kind of consistently. So I'm constantly shuttling back and forth, not just between theory and the ethnographic work, but between the ethnographic work and the kind of structural work that I'm doing, which I think helps, because then you can take what you've learned from the interviews with educators and go back to the Somali community and say, well, this is what I learned. You know, how does that jive with what you understand or what the experiences that you've had? So that shuttling back and forth is, I think, also important.
Fantastic. Well, I want to change track slightly and go to a couple more theoretical questions that are coming in. And it's really, it comes down to Bourdieu's relationship to critical realism. And this is always a point of contention, particularly within critical realist community. And it tends to be, you know, very bifurcated. There are those who are very much on Bourdieu's side. There are those who think that Bourdieu is, well, about as close to the Antichrist as one can come. I was hoping you might be able to say a little bit more about the relationship that you see between Bourdieu critical realism, well, how they might work together, how they might push each other along, and perhaps as well the points which the strengths of one, the weaknesses of the other. Just how those sorts of elements interact.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right that this is a very contentious issue within critical realism, and one that I mean, it's very clear which side I'm on in that contention. So I obviously think that Bourdieu is very helpful to critical realists and have found him helpful, and vice versa. So obviously that's kind of my positionality in that debate. I do have a paper where I wrote a lot about the sort of critiques that critical realists have had of Bourdieu and how I kind of counter those, I suppose. I mean, it's not to say that one doesn't have to then kind of move Bourdieu a little bit, because one does. I mean, it's not as if Bourdieu is a sort of ready-made critical realist necessarily, especially this notion of central conflation, which Margaret Archer has critiqued Bourdieu for. And one has to kind of suggest, and I think there are places in Bourdieu where one can see this, and I wrote about this in an article that I wrote about this very topic, that I think there are places, and obviously Bourdieu's work is a massive oeuvre that has changed, that changes over time, and so one can kind of find evidence for different positionalities within his work, but there are places within Bourdieu's work where we see that he suggests that having a kind of break between kind of analyzing the objective and analyzing the subjective, as opposed to conflating them completely together, which he might suggest in other locations. I mean, I think that there are places where one can see both sides of that kind of controversy. And so it's just a matter of being able to think about whether in your own analysis and empirical work that it's helpful for you to use Bourdieu to analyze both the field effects and the subjective components of the habitus. I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question, I guess. Yeah, I do. Obviously, I very much feel that there are aspects of critical realism that I think help us understand Bourdieu. I guess that's one way of saying it, is that we can use particular aspects, like in this talk that I gave, the ontological stratification, use particular tenets of critical realism to kind of add some complexity to Bourdieu's theories of habitus, for example. Or in the article that I wrote on the reflexive habitus, to think about reflexivity, which Bourdieu was often criticized for, and rightly so. I think that his notions of reflexivity are quite delimited. And when he was asked about it, he would kind of say, oh no, I've always talked about that, without really offering a kind of step-by-step way of understanding his work. And I think that, so one has to fill Bourdieu in as well. And I think that for me, critical realism has been a helpful tool in filling in some of those things that I find somewhat weak in Bourdieu. I guess that's one way to answer that question.
No, I think that's a good answer. You are aware, Fred Vandenberg likes to tell the story that he had an engagement with Bourdieu later in life, and Bourdieu had just come across critical realism, and Bourdieu says, yes, I am a critical realist. I don't know how much stock to put in that story, but I think you're right that there is a really interesting interplay between the two. I think of all the sort of parallel social theories or sociological theories, that there is a deep sort of connection between Bourdieu and critical realism, and one can really, drive the other forward in really interesting ways. I want to launch from this to, I suppose it's one of my pet topics, and that's to talk about another contending social theory, if we can call it a contending social theory out there, and that is assemblage theory. I know you've thought about this, and I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on, say, the relationship between critical realism and assemblage theory.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I'm actually writing on this topic right now. I think that there are certain aspects of critical realism, again, that can be helpful for thinking about assemblage theory, though I also am perhaps more critical of assemblage theory than you are, for example, in your work. But I think that there are interesting resonances. So I find that both are trying to really understand heterogeneity. And I think that that is where the similarities come together. So the fact that the social world is extremely heterogeneous and is very complex and multi-layered, for example, I think that both sets of theories approach the social in that way. And I think that that's the kind of starting point for thinking about the accordances between the two of them. And I think that so I think that's sort of the place to start, is this really, the understanding of the social is not just an open system, but an extremely complex one that is emergent at different levels, that is layered, that is constantly shifting in its contingent relationship to the experiences of people. So it's these kinds of things that I think are the the bridges between assemblage theory and critical realism. I think, again, that sometimes and it depends on which assemblage theorist, of course, that you're referring to, because they're very different. There's some that I think are better than others in terms of not better necessarily just straight up, but better, by better I mean more useful to sociologists. The Deleuzian tradition, for example, I think has a lot to offer sociologists, but also is problematic and difficult to social scientists, I think, because of its lack of understanding of power, which seems strange with the Deleuze in particular. But this, so basically, again, and this is maybe I'm becoming a parrot and saying the same thing over and over again, but I think that what critical realism offers these kinds of theories is actually some architecture to understanding that complexity and heterogeneity, some kind of filling in of how assemblages are formed and how they operate in particular kinds of ways with a very strong sense of power. Because I think that that is something that critical realism has that assemblage theory often doesn't, which is that the world is not just an open system that emerges into assemblages kind of ad hoc. They emerge into assemblages because of systems of power that that make them converge in particular kinds of ways and that structure them hierarchically. And so I think that's one of the things that critical realism brings to assemblage theory is a sense of power and is some of the kind of architecture of how it is that assemblages form and why it is that certain assemblages form when others don't form. Which I think sometimes is left out of theories like Delanda's theory, even Deleuze in some ways. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. I think there is. I think this is probably consistent across a lot of social science and a lot of social scientific theories. Just the problem of causation caused by positivism and trying to rethink causation in a sort of post-positivist tradition. And so you lose these elements in the various theories. I mean, even in Bourdieu, it's very underdeveloped. He talks about mechanisms at a number of points, but again, there's just they're gestures. There's not that sort of rich account behind them.
Yeah, you're right, actually. And in his analysis of fields, it's often as if I mean, there are certain places in Bourdieu where we have, really key actors like the Flaubert. But there are also places where the field dynamics are just sort of happening as if there isn't, right. So I think that some of the kind of, there's a sort of way macro kind of approach, and there's what critical realism does is kind of fill in maybe that middle part a little bit in a helpful way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think, Claire, we might leave it there. So thank you so much for spending the time to present on realist ethnography and for unpacking some of the implications in questions. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, before everybody disappears, I just want to remind everybody that the recording will be made available very, very shortly, and all the recordings from our previous webinars and presentations are in fact available online. And if you subscribe to our network through our website, follow our Twitter feed, our YouTube channel, or join our Facebook group, you'll receive notification when the recordings are made live. And you'll also find out more about upcoming events, including a symposium on realist ethnography that Claire is hosting in Chicago on March 11. There are two fantastic panels, and I would encourage you, if you're in the area, to definitely attend. And if not, then certainly to look at the website and see what you're missing out on. You'll also find out about our next webinars. And our next webinar is with Andrew Sayer on the topic of flourishing as being a necessary concept for social science. Now, Andrew Sayer is a long-standing critical realism. In fact, he's one of the longest-standing critical realists, and he's coming from a more Marxist tradition within critical realism. And Sayer has written a number of books on this topic, including Why Things Matter to People, The Moral Significance of Class, and one of my favorites, Why We Can't Afford the Rich. That webinar is on March 17, so please do register for that, and hopefully we'll see you there. So thank you for joining us today. Please do follow us on various social media, and please do join us next time.